whose name was not mentioned, and having had him placed on leaving the litter in the first chamber of the tower of the Bastille until the night, in order to place him and conduct him myself at 9 o'clock of the evening with M.I. de Rosarges, one of the sergeants whom Monsieur the Governor had brought into the third chamber south of the tower of the Bretaudiere, which I had had furnished with everything some days before his arrival, having received Monsieur de Saint-Mars's order for it, which prisoner will be subject to and served by Mr. de Rosarges, and provisioned by Monsieur the Governor. The second part, of which the title is List of Prisoners who left the Bastille, to commence from the 11th of the month of October, when I am entered into possession in the year 1690, contains at the back of folio 80 what follows. On the same day, Monday, 19th November 1703, the unknown prisoner, always masked with a mask of black velvet, whom Monsieur de Saint-Mars, governor, had brought with him on coming from the Isles Sainte Marguerite, whom he had guarded since a long time, and who, having found himself yesterday rather ill on leaving Mass, died today at 10 o'clock at night, without having had any great illness. He could not have had less. Giraud. Our chaplain confessed him yesterday, but, surprised by his death, he has not received the sacraments, and our chaplain exhorted him a moment before dying, and this unknown prisoner, so long detained, was interred on Tuesday, 20th November, at 4 o'clock of the afternoon in the cemetery of St. Paul, our parish, on the register of deaths in Beau. Was also given a name unknown to Monsieur de Rosarges, Major, and Mr. Rail, surgeon, who have signed the register. Baru is symbol. I have since learnt that he was named on the register M. de Marchal, and that 40 L were paid for his burial. For every unprejudiced and impartial reader, these unaffected pages are conclusive, and do not inspire any doubt. But it is not the same for Tauler's. According to him, Father Griffith himself, and not Dujonka, is the author of this document, in which, with infinite art, he has introduced several points of obscurity, and succeeded in misleading forever all those who should be tempted to raise the veil. He has commenced by imagining the two dates of 1698 and 1703, so that it would be impossible to apply them to Avidic, who was still at Constantinople in 1706. It is designedly that, with an infinity of precautions, he has drawn attention to this fact which he had invented at will. Saint Mars had this prisoner at Pignerol, a point on which he insists by saying further on, this prisoner whom he had guarded since a long time. To make Dujonka twice affirm that the man with the iron mask was first detained at Pignerol, of course, absolutely sets Avidic aside. The affectation of speaking several times of the Abbé Giraud, chaplain of the Bastille, is equally significant to Tolles, in so much that it reveals the cunning intention of carefully avoiding having to name the Jesuits, even when it concerns the Bastille, to which one of them was constantly attached. It is true that the registers of the Church of St. Paul confirm Dujonka's journal, since the interment of the prisoner is related in them under the date of November 20th, 1703. But this objection does not embarrass Taules. Without going so far as to suppose that these registers have also been falsified, he is very willing to accept them as authentic. But, says he, this prisoner interred November 20, 1703, is not the one brought by St. Mars to the Bastille. It is some obscure stranger, and Father Griffith, finding on the registers of this church the proof of his death in 1703, has used it as a basis on which to erect his falsehoods, and by attracting to him the exclusive attention of posterity, has turned it aside from Avidic, and has necessarily rendered ulterior investigations fruitless. But it is nothing of the kind. In this painful episode of Louis XIV's reign, the Jesuits have their share of responsibility, owing to the pressure which they put upon Ferriol, but they are completely innocent of the forgeries of which they have been accused. The perfect authenticity of Dujonka's journal is shown by many proofs. It suffices to have read it and assured oneself that it is not composed of detached leaves afterwards bound together, but has been written all entire by the same incorrect and simple pen, in order to be convinced of the impossibility of the least alteration. Either it is a forgery from beginning to end, or the pages relating to the Iron Mask have for their author that kind of general superintendent of the Bastille, sometimes too pompously styled lieutenant of the king, sometimes fulfilling the humble functions of turnkey, devoted to his multifarious duties, who ought to be believed for his ignorance of certain things as much as for his complete knowledge of others, for the unfeigned simplicity of his language, and the tone of sincere assurance that runs uniformly throughout the entire journal. Moreover, not only is all that concerns the other prisoners corroborated by indisputable dispatches deposited in other archives, but the most reliable documents absolutely confirm the dates, and even some of the points indicated in the two accounts we have just quoted. Dujanka says in the first, I had had his chamber furnished with everything some days before his arrival, having received M. de Saint-Mars's order for it. Now a dispatch as yet unpublished and of especial importance contains what follows: Barbezieux to Saint-Mars. Marly, July 19, 1698. I have received the letter which you have taken the trouble to write to me the 9th of this month. The king finds it good that you should leave the Isles Sainte-Marguerite to go to the Bastille with your old prisoner, taking your precautions to prevent his being either seen or known by anyone. You can write in advance to His Majesty's lieutenant of this chateau to have a chamber ready so as to be able to place your prisoner in it on your arrival. This dispatch cannot be questioned. It exists in the archives of the Ministry of War. It was written by the minister Barbezieux a short time previous to Saint-Mars's departure for the Bastille, and like many others which we shall quote hereafter, it establishes in a formal manner that in 1698, and not later, the man with the iron mask entered the Bastille, and that no alteration has consequently been made in Dujonca's journal. But to these definitive proofs let us add others drawn from Avadic's very singular end. Let us return to this individual at the moment when he treads the French soil for the first time, and let us follow him to his death, less in order to complete our demonstration that he is not the man with the iron mask, which would be superfluous, than to throw every light upon this little-known individual and pursue to its denouement the story of this extraordinary crime. Chapter 5 of the present work. See Peep. 62-63 Ante, Histoire de l'homme au masque de fer, p. 233. Ibid, p. 229. Order of Louis XIV, dated October 11, 1565. Letter of Louvois to Saint-Mars, September 23, 1566. Ibid, September 17, 1669. Letter of Madame de Sévigné, July 7, 1680. Correspondence Générale, Lavalier's edition, volume EP1. Let us cite amongst others the fine Histoire de Madame de Maintenon, of the Duc de Noailles, unhappily still unfinished, the labors of me Théophile Lavalier in Chapter 1, period, E.I. Of the curious volumes of Micherouel, Saint-Simon considéré comme historien, which is the necessary complement of his edition of the Memoirs. Lettres historiques et édifiantes de Madame de Maintenon, volume p. 213, Histoire de l'homme au masque de fer, p. 244, Conrad Manuscripts, volume C. p. 51, Archives of the Arsenal. The same observations apply to this other letter, likewise ascribed by M. Lacroix to Madame de Maintenon, and with as little ground. Until now I was so thoroughly persuaded of my strength that I would have defied all the earth. But I confess that the last interview I had with you charmed me. I found in your conversation 1,000 pleasures which I had not expected. In short, if I ever see you alone, I do not know what will happen. Memoires sur Nicolas Fouquet, Vol. IPP 448449, Souvenirs de Madame de Caylus, pp. 20 and 11, Mes Foulées de Concheux, Causeries d'un Curieux, Vol. E. P. 5015, Michel Saint-Simon considéré comme historien, p. 504, Esquisse. This is what I have several times been assured of by M. Ravissant, who, in publishing the documents relating to the Bastille, has come across the affaire des Poisons. M. Pierre Clément, La Police sous Louis XIV, p. 221, Ibid, p. 222. A councillor to the Parliament named Pignon du Martray, a relation of Fouquet's, was suspected of having been connected with the Sieur d'Amy, who was accused of a plot against Colbert's life. M. Pierre Clément, La Police sous Louis XIV, p. 221. In support of this opinion, Millecroix, in the work already referred to, pp. 251-252, speaks of a letter written by Louis XIV to Pope Clement VI, in which he requested him to grant him a secret dispensation in order that he might rid himself, without form of trial, of a man dangerous and hurtful to his government. Lacroix adds that Clement X was probably opposed to the death of the prisoner at Pignerol. But M.C. Lacroix does not give this very strange letter of Louis XIV as, which he terms the keystone of his theory, contenting himself with observing, "This letter, so strange that people would wish to deny its existence, is among the manuscripts in the Bibliothèque du Roi." M. Champollion Figeac, who discovered it 3 years ago among the papiers de Bouillot, told me the tenor of it at that time, at the very moment I was setting off on a long journey. But unfortunately he forgot to take a note of the volume containing this singular paper, and since my return he has in vain sought to find it again. The learned M. Libri also remembers having seen this precious document. The following is the truth about this letter, and the origin of the remarks of M.M. Champollion Figeac and Libri. It is in the Recueil Bouillot manuscripts of the Imperial Library SF 997 Vol. XXXII Catalogue that this 17th-century collector speaks of a letter in which the Cardinal de Richelieu begged the king to demand from the Pope a brief allowing him to put to death, without any form of trial, those whom he considered deserving of it, a request which Pope Urban VIII refused. M.P. Clément has already quoted this extract in Note 2 p. 222 of his Police sous Louis XIV. M. Lacroix will thus see that his letter does not concern Louis XIV, Clement X, and Fouquet, but rather Louis XIII, Urban VIII, and some unknown victims. Most of the complaints that Fouquet mentions in his letters are due to a too great abundance of blood. Letters from Louvois to Saint-Mars, April 3rd and May 4th, 1580. Ibid, Abro 9, 1380. Cheruel, who arrives at the conclusion that Fouquet died in March 1680, observes, with reason, that a passage from the Memoires de Gourville is alone in contradiction with other contemporary testimony, but that the contradiction is only apparent. According to Bussy-Rabutin, Fouquet was authorized in 1680 to go to the waters of Bourbon. We have not referred to this authorization because no document makes mention of it. But the report was spread about at Paris, and it is not surprising that Gourville, writing his recollections long after the events, should have confounded the authorization with the realization of this journey and have said, Fouquet having been set at liberty, c. It is nevertheless in reference to this passage that Voltaire writes in his Siècle de Louis XIV. Hence it is not known where this unfortunate man died, whose most insignificant actions were of importance while he was powerful. Voltaire has sacrificed truth to effect of style. Madame de Sévigné knew of it. Poor Monsieur Fouquet is dead. I regret it. I have never lost so many friends. Bussy knew of it. You know, I think of the death of Fouquet by apoplexy at the time he was permitted to take the Bourbon waters. The family knew of it, since several of its members were at Pignerol in March 1680. Gourville was the only one who was not correctly informed, but we have just seen in what manner and why he differs from other contemporaries. Paraletti, sur la mort du surintendant Fouquet, notes Ricialis à Pignerol, quarto, 24 pages, Turin, 1812. Ibid, p. 20. Paraletti also concluded that the death of Fouquet took place in March 1680. There are equally the conclusions of a work in preparation by M. Gaultier de Clobret on this special question, and which will form part of that beautiful historical series to which for some years past we have been indebted to the city of Paris. The ancient convent of Stae Claire is now a home for beggars. M. Jacopo Bernardi, honorary Grand Vicar of the Bishop of Pignerol, writes to me that in the country the death of Fouquet in 1680 is still a tradition. I take this opportunity of thanking my obliging and learned correspondent for the information with which he has been good enough to furnish me about Pignerol. See especially letters of Madame Sévigné, April 3rd and 5, 1680. The name is written in several ways. I have chosen the orthography most generally adopted in the dispatches. We find Mattioli, Mattioli, and Mattioli, Mattioli, and Mattioli, and Mattioli. Louis XIV writes it indiscriminately, Mattioli, Mattioli, and Mattioli in different ways, even in the same dispatch. Trans. P. Clément quotes a curious example of this negligence in his Police sous Louis XIV, p. 122, note 1. The correct name of the Italian, accomplice of Sainte Croix in the Affaire des Poisons, was Egidio, but in the documents he is called Exili. Unpublished dispatch, Archives of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Section Savoy, 68. It is from this dispatch that the motto of the present work has been taken, Mémoires de Saint-Simon, Vol. I.E., pp. 70, 108, 1008, 19. M. Jules Loiseleur, Revue Contemporaine, p. 2036. Chapter 14. Avedic is at first confined in the prisons of the Arsenal. From Marseille he is conducted to Mount Saint-Michel. Description of Mount Saint-Michel. Treatment to which Avedic is exposed, his useless protestations against this abuse of force, universal emotion excited throughout the East, complaints of the Divan, Feriol's impudence, terrible reprisals practiced on the Catholics, false Avedicts, expedients to which Feriol is reduced, inquietude of the Roman court, duplicity of Louis XIV's government. Avedic is transferred to the Bastille, suggestions of which he is the object. He abjures and is set at liberty. It was not at Marseille that Avedic was detained, neither was he sent, as has been said, to Messina or to the Isle Sainte Marguerite to be imprisoned. Louis XIV was too prudent and too circumspect to leave in a port of the Mediterranean an individual whom his co-religionists, supported by the Ottoman Porte, were energetically demanding and seeking with anxious solicitude. Directly the government of Louis XIV was advised of the outcry which the disappearance of the Grand Patriarch had excited in the East, An exempt was sent to Marseille to M. Septicels, to M. de Montmort, intendant of the galleys, in order to withdraw Avadic from the prisons of the arsenal, and conduct him, under good and sure guard, to the other extremity of France. At the same time it was enjoined to all governors, mayors, syndics, and other officials to give the exempt every protection, aid, and assistance in case of need, rather an unnecessary precaution in the case of this weak and inoffensive old man. Near the ancient boundary of Brittany and Normandy rises a narrow rock surrounded on all sides by the waves, or by quicksands left uncovered by the sea when it falls at every tide. These sands, which extend to the firm land over a distance of nearly a couple of miles, are rendered very dangerous to cross by the mouths of several small streams. On this rock, impressed with a savage grandeur, some monks had, in the 8th century, constructed a monastery where they lived isolated from the rest of the world, from which they were sometimes separated by vast plains of sand, and sometimes by the waters of the sea at regular but not far distant intervals. It was to this abbey of Mount Saint-Michel, occupied by Benedictines, alternately devoting themselves to work and prayer, that the Grand Patriarch of the Armenians was conducted. The prior of the abbey received orders to strictly guard the prisoner brought to him, without allowing him to hold communication with anyone, either by word of mouth or by writing. A very superfluous precaution in the case of an Armenian whose language nobody knew, who was ignorant of French, and who found himself in the midst of monks who from his arrival were taught to curse him. He was represented to them, indeed, as a detestable persecutor of Catholics, this man who had been 3 times exiled and twice deposed by them, snatched violently from his country, at one time cast upon the coast of Syria and confined in a dungeon into which the water penetrated, at another carried into a strange land, thousands of miles from his native land, where for 5 years he was to drag out a miserable existence and then die. An object of horror to the monks, doubly exiled in this place of exile, like them separated from the world by obstacles almost as insuperable as those which parted them, separated from them also by the repulsion which he inspired, more unhappy still than in his first prison, where at least he breathed the air of his native land, Avadic could not even preserve the hope of being delivered. That consolatory prospect which his meeting with Spartoli at Genoa had permitted him to entertain, he was now obliged to renounce, since, even supposing that his letters had reached the Ottoman port, no one would dream of coming to seek him on so distant and desert a coast. As far as his gaze extended, he could expect to see no vessel of deliverance appear. Whether the sea covered the sands or whether it ebbed and left them dry, there was the same frightful solitude, the same mournful silence, broken at times by the roar of the waves beating against the rock, or by the peaceful and monotonous chants of the monks. For 10 months he listened to their prayers without being allowed to take part in them, and he lived in the most absolute isolation. But on July 13, 1707, Pontchartrain wrote to the prior of Mount Saint-Michel that he might allow the prisoner to hear Mass and even admit him to confession. "The king," he added, "does not pretend to deprive him of the succor which he might find in this sacrament, and his Majesty has merely thought that, before admitting him to it, you ought to have him examined with especial care, as it is to be feared, from what has already happened, that his devotion is only feigned and illusory, in order to deceive and induce you to guard him with less care. Singular fear of a flight, impracticable in itself, and impossible to be prolonged for any length of time in a country where all was strange and hostile to him." Pontchartrain requested the general of the Benedictines at Rome to send to Mount Saint-Michel a monk learned in Oriental languages, to whom the most absolute discretion was prescribed with respect to the disclosures which Avadic might make to him otherwise than under the seal of confession, but which were not to be kept secret from the prior, who was charged to transmit them to the minister. Thus it was that they did not content themselves with detaining the person of the patriarch. They endeavored to penetrate to the recesses of his soul, with the view of enlightening themselves upon the true sentiments and possibly upon the projects of the prisoner. The first word that he utters, and which can be understood, is a protest of right against might. "Let them judge me," he says, "and condemn me to the punishment that I deserve, or, if I am innocent, let it be proclaimed, and let them set me at liberty." He was neither judged nor set at liberty, and his protest, forwarded by the Prior de Versailles, was suppressed in Pontchartrain's cabinet. It is true that at the same time the most alarming intelligence reached the minister from Constantinople, coupled with the most pressing entreaties from the court of the Vatican and from the French embassy at the Porte to isolate and guard the prisoner more strictly still. On receiving the news of Avadic's disappearance, the officers of the Divan and the Grand Vizier himself, justly excited, had demanded of Ferriol what had become of him. The French ambassador answered with assurance that the individual in question had not been given in charge to him, and that no doubt the vessel on board which he had been carried into exile was one of those English or Dutch corsairs which the Grand Seigneur tolerated, even in the Dardanelles, to the prejudice of his custom-house officers and of the interests of his sovereignty. This attempted diversion did not succeed for any length of time. English and Dutch, questioned in their turn, having no satisfactory reply to give, the Grand Vizier ordered torture to be applied to the Shao who had conducted Avadic to Shao, and in the midst of his torments the wretch avowed the whole truth. The Vizier at once solemnly sent the Shao Bachi to the French embassy in order to claim Avadic as a subject of the Grand Seigneur. Mauro Cordato, the first interpreter of the Divan, presented himself a few minutes afterwards to join his demands to those of the Shao Bachi and to insist that the abducted person should be immediately sent back to Constantinople. The preciseness and energy of the demand did not trouble Ferriol, and with great presence of mind he replied, "I am ignorant of all that has happened, and truly I cannot have any confidence in the depositions of the Shao charged to conduct Avadic." He declared, on returning to Constantinople, that he had been taken prisoner by a corsair. Who will say that the second deposition, made during the torments of the torture, is more accurate than the "to Italy" or France? He will be punished. But may it not be the case that the ex-patriarch, fearing death in his third exile, has employed the captain to take him to a place of safety? Little satisfied with this reply, Mauro Cordato threatened Ferriol, in the Sultan's name, with general persecutions against the Armenian Catholics. "If Avadic is in France," answered Ferriol, "I shall write with the view of his being compelled to return. But the Grand Seigneur is master of his own subjects. He can have all the Armenians put to death indifferently, without any such threat being able to make me acknowledge that of which I am ignorant." The threat was put into execution, and the Catholics, in whose pretended interest Avadic was abducted, were the objects of a frightful vengeance. A Hatti sheriff ordered the arrest of the principal Armenians of the Latin Rite, 9 of whom escaped death by apostasy, and 3 intrepidly confessing their faith, died martyrs near the Pamakapu Gate. Several Armenians were put to the torture and questioned during their torments as to the fate of Avadic. All proselytizing was interdicted to the Jesuits, and the printing establishment which they had founded was destroyed. The 2 Armenian patriarchs who had authorized the Catholic missionaries to preach in their churches were arrested and thrown into prison. A Barat of the Sultan recalled Avadic to the post of Grand Patriarch. His vekil or vicar, Joannes, was appointed to fulfill his duty. So true is it that violence invariably leads to violence, and that an abuse of force is sooner or later followed by reprisals which, although they are to be deplored, cannot be altogether condemned, since, if they are without excuse, they at least have their explanation in an immutable law common to all nations and all epochs. This exasperation against the Catholics was equaled only by the affection which their unfortunate victim inspired. In all the churches, prayers were said every evening for his prompt return. For a moment it was believed that they were answered. The news spread through Constantinople that Avidic was at Rodosto, a town 30 leagues off. Some Armenians immediately set off to meet him, with the view of bringing him back in triumph. But they only found an impostor who had succeeded in deceiving a large number of schismatics and in collecting a considerable sum in alms by taking advantage of the enthusiasm excited everywhere by the mere name of the patriarch. All that concerned the fate of this beloved chief was sought after with avidity and accepted with a credulous but touching confidence. One day an Armenian affirmed that he had seen him in Holland and received a magnificent present for this happy piece of news. He disappeared, however, before it was discovered to be false. Later, 2 Turkish slaves from Malta affirmed that Avidic was detained there a prisoner. They contrived by this artifice to get their ransoms paid, and the false information brought by them not being devoid of probability, 2 rich Armenians determined to charter a vessel and proceed to Malta to claim the prisoner. Fariol called upon to furnish them with a letter of recommendation both for Malta and for Rome, where they were to continue their researches, ostensibly did so. But he secretly forwarded by another channel to the Cardinal de la Trémouille, French ambassador to the Holy See, a private dispatch in which he recommended the greatest circumspection and the exercise of an incessant surveillance over the 2 Armenians. With reference to the divan, whose demands continued to be both precise and firm, Fariol, reduced to shifts, was always contriving fresh artifices in order to appease the Grand Vizier's resentment. At times he promised to send one of the officers of the embassy in search of Avidic. Then, the report having spread abroad that the Grand Patriarch was confined at Messina, Fariol engaged to beg the King of France to demand of his grandson Philip V, King of Spain, that he should be set at liberty and sent back. But he always affirmed that he was a stranger to the abduction, and that he was entirely ignorant of where Avidic was. On this last point, and on that only, he was sincere. The government of Louis XIV had concealed even from its representative at Constantinople the transfer of the prisoner to Mount Saint-Michel, and Fariol, very well informed of every detail of Avidic's transport to Marseille, had been prudently kept in the most with them. He at least inspired them by his spiteful insistence, by his implacability in pursuing his enemy even in his most profound and most irretrievable fall. He does not care to demand the death of the sinner, he says, but he must do penance and must never be set at liberty. If Avidic is in the prisons of the Holy Office, we read in another dispatch, he will never leave them. If he is in France, I beg of you to order him to be placed in a dark chamber from which he can never behold the day. Whatever penance, says he elsewhere, he may perform for his crimes and for his persecution of the Latins will never be sufficiently great. From Rome also the most earnest entreaties and the most pressing recommendations to confine the prisoner still more closely reached Louis XIV. Twice did the Minister of Exterior Relations, the Marquis de Torcy, charge the Cardinal de la Trémouille to remove the inquietudes of the congregation of the Holy Office. The orders to redouble attention and watchfulness, wrote Torcy, have been renewed. He is seen only by the person who gives him his food. They converse only by signs, and, when he hears Mass on fête days and Sundays, he is put in a place apart from all others. At the same time, the minister informed the cardinal that the Armenians, who had come to Marseille, had departed again without being able to find any traces of Avidic. We know, he added, that the valet of the Patriarch is about to come from Leghorn to France, likewise with the view of discovering what has become of his master. But on his arrival he will be arrested and closely imprisoned. These dispatches were, we see, of a nature to entirely reassure the Holy Office, and Louis XIV showed himself as vigilant a guardian of Avidic's person as he had been, through his ambassador, the principal author, and, in his dispatches, the unreserved approver of the abduction. He went further still, and entering in his turn on that path of duplicity in which Feriol had long since outstripped him, Louis XIV wrote to his representative near the port, "It is impossible for us to satisfy the Grand Vizier's demands with reference to Avadik. He is no longer in a state to be sent living to Constantinople." Louis XIV added that the news of his death had been given him at the very moment when, in order to be agreeable to the Grand Vizier, he was having the Patriarch sought for in Spain and Italy with the view of delivering him up to his legitimate sovereign. This prisoner, still sufficiently menacing and formidable at the bottom of his dungeon for Rome as well as Versailles to be thus concerned about his fate, this old man, the object of so many preoccupations and, throughout the whole of the Levant, of regrets which he did not even have the consolation of knowing, was not thought to be sufficiently surely isolated by the sands and the sea that surround Mount Saint-Michel. The moats, the massive doors, and the towers of the Bastille were considered necessary. "On December 18, 1709, says Tujonka in his journal, there has entered a very important prisoner whose name was not mentioned. This was Avadik, whose death, announced by Louis XIV, the majority of the Armenians had long since been mourning. The same recommendations which the prior of Mount Saint-Michel had received were given to M. Chill, de Berneville, governor of the state prison, and he was forbidden to allow the slightest communication between his new prisoner and any other person. However, Louis XIV was not slow in authorizing an exception to this rule, a project long since favored by the king's government and the execution of which would render it forever impossible for Avadik to return to Constantinople, was about to be realized. This was to instruct him in the Catholic religion, to determine him to submit to the authority of the Holy See, and thus to lead him to discredit himself with those of his co-religionists who still doubted of his death. Such was the end, for the accomplishment of which a monk had been placed near the Patriarch during the 2 years of his stay at Mount Saint-Michel. At the Bastille, the suggestions became more pressing, and Armenian books were given to him, in which he might learn the Catholic doctrines and convince himself how narrow were the grounds of difference which separated the Latin Armenians from the schismatics. These he traversed, and on September 22, 1710, he abjured between the hands of the Cardinal de Noailles, Archbishop of Paris, by an instrument written in the Armenian language, 3 translations of which in Latin were delivered, one to the cardinal, another to the Minister of Exterior Relations, and the third to Avadik himself. A few days afterwards he was ordained priest in the Church of Notre Dame. This abjuration was the only means Avadik had of recovering his liberty, and, depressed by so many storms, he ceded, after 5 years of close captivity, to the natural desire of breathing a free air during the few remaining years that he had to live. In the early part of 1711, an old man, bowed by adversity still more than by weight of years, his countenance furrowed by deep wrinkles, his eyesight nearly gone, might be seen every morning to leave a little house in the Rue Ferou, where he dwelt with his interpreter. Having preserved in his attire some remnant of the Armenian costume, being a foreigner in language and manners, and sustaining by the aid of a stick his enfeebled body, he attracted attention, and people followed him with their glances to the church of Saint-Sulpice, to which he was attached as priest, and where he every day said Mass. This was the religious chief and civil protector of several millions of Armenians, the enemy of Feriol and of the Jesuits, and the vanquished in the long struggle sustained against them. He did not long enjoy his liberty, but died on July 21st, 1711, 10 months after having quitted the Bastille, without relations or friends, having demanded and received the consolations and the sacraments of that Roman Church whose ardent missionaries had been the cause of all his misfortunes. Thus terminated this life, commenced in obscurity and misery, continued on the patriarchal throne, crossed with unhoped-for elevations and sudden falls, and completed mournfully in exile. Louis XIV, exhausting precautions and pushing imposture and mockery to their extreme limits, had an instrument drawn up by the Lieutenant of Police d'Argenson, in which were attested the king's sorrow on hearing of this death, and the promptitude which the monarch had shown in giving liberty to the prisoner directly the foreigner had been able to make it understood what his quality was. By a singular euphemism, Avedic was termed a disgracié, and Louis XIV declared that he had never approved the violence, and still less the crimes, which, unknown to His Majesty, had been committed in Turkey on the person of the deceased. This lying document was to have been sent to Constantinople in case the Porte should reclaim Avedic in too menacing a manner, but it was unnecessary. Several changes of Grand Viziers contributed to abate the demands, and to render them less pressing. At long intervals, the name of the ex-patriarch recurred in the conversations between the Ottoman Prime Minister and the French ambassador. Then, by degrees, the divan no longer occupied itself with it. The remembrance of Avedic was less profoundly engrafted there than in the grateful hearts of the Armenians. But this is not the complete denouement of the drama. At the very time when Theriol's victim was dying, he himself was returning from Constantinople insane, having been 2 years since replaced in his post, which, with an extravagant pretension, he had, however, up to that time refused to quit. It was, in some measure, necessary to use force to compel him to embark. For a long time he had recognized the enormous fault he had committed, and on January 6, 1709, had written to Torcy, "I know only of one thing for which people can reproach me. It is the abduction of Avedic." But this was not the cause of his recall, which was evidently entirely due to the too certain signs of his insanity. It cannot be denied that Louis XIV approved the violation of the law of nations, of which Avedic was the victim, and if the Catholic missionaries are responsible for having suggested this crime, as Feriol is for the orders transmitted to Kio, the government of Louis XIV is not the less so for having prolonged and aggravated its consequences by the treatment to which the prisoner was subjected. Chapter 15. Description of Pignerol, its past, its situation, portrait of St. Mars, his scruples and his integrity, Fouquet's arrival at Pignerol, brief account of the surintendant's career, his error with regard to Louis XIV, whom he betrays, causes of Fouquet's fall, his arrest, his trial, his condemnation. No kind of obscurity in this affair. Of the principal personages in whom people have seen the man with the iron mask, we have first got rid of those imaginary beings, those pretended brothers of Louis XIV, whom it was necessary to banish to the domain of fiction. Afterwards, entering into that of reality, we have studied the lives of several princes whom people have also covered with the mysterious mask, but whom we have shown as dying elsewhere than at the Bastille, as Vermandois before Courtrai, Monmouth on the scaffold, and Beaufort at the siege of Candia. These accounts have been followed by the story of a great state prisoner under Louis XIV, in whose favor very strong presumptions have been advanced, but who was incarcerated neither at Pignerol nor at the Isles Sainte-Marguerite, and who ended his days in liberty. Let us now penetrate with St. Mars into Pignerol, and among the individuals confided to his care, let us seek which of them, confined for a long time in this fortress, next at the Isles Sainte-Marguerite, and lastly conducted to the Bastille, where he died on November 19, 1703, is really the man with the iron mask. At the entrance to the valleys of the Chizone and the Lemena, on the slope of one of those hills in which by insensible gradations the great chain of the Alps terminates on the side of Piedmont, there arose in the form of an amphitheater a little town which, from the 12th century, the princes of Savoy had caused to be fortified for the safety of their states, the approach to which it defended. At the summit of the hill, formerly covered with a forest of pines whence the town received its name, a citadel surrounded by fortifications had been constructed, which was commanded on the north alone by the mountain of Saint-de-Brigitte, soon to be itself covered with redoubts and entrenchments. Having thus become a military position of the greatest importance, and, as the key of Italy, able in turns to check or favor foreign invasions, the position of Pignerol, coveted by the kings of France, and so precious to the Dukes of Piedmont, was long disputed by arms or claimed by diplomacy. Captured in 1532 by Francis I from the too feeble Duke Charles III, restored by Henry III. In 1574 to Philibert Emmanuel, attacked unsuccessfully in 1595 by the Duc de Lesdiguières, it ended in 1630 by falling into the power of Cardinal de Richelieu, who took possession of it at the head of 40,000 men and placed it under the rule of the King of France, to whom it was destined to belong until the disasters of the latter years of Louis XIV. Richelieu, Mazarin, and Louvois contributed to render its fortifications formidable. Today there remain only a few ruins of them near to the Cathedral of Saint-Maurice, whence there is a charming view. Very different, however, was the appearance of Pignerol in 1664, the period at which St. Mars proceeded thither to take possession of the donjon of the citadel, converted into a state prison. On the side of the hill were to be seen the houses of the town with their low red-tiled roofs, their slight-looking campaniles, and their chimneys in the form of turrets. Here and there on certain houses, battlements and loopholes might be detected, the remains of some old defense or a useful precaution against future attack. As one raised the eyes, life and action were seen to gradually disappear, giving place to the dull, monotonous service of a fortified post. On the summit wide ditches isolated the citadel from the town, whilst beyond, a double line of thick walls formed a vast parallelogram flanked by 4 lofty towers. Along the breastworks, near the drawbridges, and on the bastions, soldiers were on guard, and in the courtyards others were lounging about. Lastly, in the center of all these fortifications was a large square donjon, silent yet appearing as though inhabited, and having its windows covered with iron bars. Somber and sinister in aspect, this black-looking mass towered to the skies. Such may we picture to ourselves, after the lapse of a couple of centuries, was the dwelling of those prisoners, some celebrated like Fouquet, others mysterious like the Iron Mask, who have rendered Pignerol forever famous in history and legend. Between the severe aspect of this donjon and the character of its new commandant, there was a perfect similarity, and no one united in himself more completely than St. Mars the necessary qualities for fulfilling the duties confided to him. Benin d'Auvergne, Seigneur de Saint-Mars, was a petty gentleman of Champagne, from the neighborhood of Montfort-l'Amaury, when he entered the first company of the king's Musketeers. At 34 years of age, he had just attained the rank of quartermaster, when Fouquet was arrested at Nantes in 1661. In this affair he shared the royal confidence with his lieutenant, D'Artagnan, and whilst the latter was charged with the arrest of the surintendant, St. Mars had confided to him the mission of arresting Pelisson and conducting him to Angers. Selected by Louis XIV in 1664 as being capable of securely guarding Fouquet at Pignerol, he was named commandant of the donjon of this place and captain of a free company. He immediately proceeded to Pignerol, and from that time devoted himself to those weighty duties of gaoler with which he was to be occupied in various prisons, and last of all at the Bastille, until his death, always with the same overpowering sense of his responsibility which made him in reality the chief of Louis XIV's state prisoners. He possessed the gaoler's 2 principal qualifications, a discretion which was proof against everything, combined with a distrust such as the suspicious Louvois himself had occasionally to restrain while he had but rarely to put him on the alert. He was not, like D'Artagnan, an intelligent, generous, and frank executor of the royal will. With a somewhat narrow and extremely timid disposition, alike taciturn and restless, one thought alone possessed and ruled him, the servile accomplishment of the king's orders. To discuss them would have seemed a crime to him. To seek to interpret them appeared superfluous. He answered for the prisoners confided to his care. The height of the walls, the depth and width of the moats, the vigilance of the sentinels, the carefulness of the watchmen, the strength of the iron gratings, did not suffice to calm the inquietude of his suspicious mind. In endeavoring to dissipate it, he did not content himself with informing Louvois of the most minute details, the most puerile circumstances. His scruples and uneasiness were everlastingly reviving. Everything was in his eyes a matter for suspicion, and his troubled imagination never ceased to foresee pretended plans of flight. A stranger visiting Pignerol and regarding the citadel with a little attention immediately became an object of suspicion to him and was arrested, subjected to a long examination, and imprisoned for a length of time. Every month he had a list drawn up of strangers arriving in the town with the view of noticing the names which appeared in it too frequently. The linen of his prisoners before leaving the donjon was carefully plunged into a tub of water and then dried at a fire in the presence of officers charged in rotation to assure themselves of the absence of all writing upon it. The least change observed in the habits of the prisoners was a source of painful worry to St. Mars, appearing to him in the light of a mysterious signal designed to expedite a criminal attempt, and one day, after his usual visit and long search in the rooms of Fouquet and de Lauzun, not having been able to discover the slightest sign of anything abnormal, he was at first surprised and then very much alarmed. This absence of signals doubtless seemed to him a signal of itself. For the rest, an honest man, greedy of gain, but seeking it only by legitimate means, insensible to the reproaches of his prisoners, finding in the sentiment of having done his duty sufficient strength to be able to disdain their abuse, and acting humanely on the very rare occasions when their safety did not seem to be compromised. After having perused his frank and unaffected correspondence, in which one has a complete portrait of him, one is almost tempted to pity St. Mars as much as his prisoners, because, while enjoying as little liberty as they did, he was to some extent their victim, being secretly preyed upon by the incessant and painful fear of their escape. The continual inquietude by which he was agitated rendered him a prematurely old man, and contemporaries represent him as bent in figure, very thin, his head, hands, and entire body trembling, in a word, overwhelmed by the heavy burden of the responsibility which weighed him down. It was under the care of this man that Fouquet was to pass the last 16 years of his life. It was with him that the imprisonment of the surintendant was in reality about to commence. From the day of his arrest, indeed, until his arrival at Pignerol, 1,000 intrigues had been brewing around him. The threats of his enemies, the pressing exertions of his friends, by turns the danger of capital punishment, and the hope of being saved, with constant changes of prison and the preoccupations of the trial, had absorbed his existence, and found himself at Pignerol, in a chamber into which the light penetrated only through osier screens, fixed on enormous bars of iron, waited upon by unknown individuals who were removed so soon as he endeavored to interest them in his misfortunes, and who were continued in his service if they consented to act as spies over him, when the only visits he received were those of his gaoler coming every day to carefully examine his furniture, rummage over his. How often in his isolation did he invoke the dazzling picture of his unprecedented fortune? How many times did he recount to himself the great part he had played during the Fronde, the legitimate influence acquired over Anne of Austria and Mazarin, whose devoted auxiliary he had been, so many and such high functions united in his own person, a great part of the court at his feet, friends like Corneille and Molière, Madame de Sévigné, Pelisson, and La Fontaine, dwellings much more splendid than the king's, a formidable fortified place for refuge, an island in America for an asylum, asylum, the right of sovereignty over many towns, joined to immense riches, the most ardent passion satiated, and the most unbridled ambition satisfied. There is no greater sorrow, says Dante, than to recall when in misery our time of happiness. But how much greater still when the eyes, at length seeing distinctly, can perceive the imprudences and the faults committed. Rendered more clear-sighted by adversity, Fouquet might remember with bitterness Louis XIV's generous conduct towards him on his taking possession of power after the death of Mazarin. "I knew," says the king in his memoirs, "that he possessed intelligence and had a great knowledge of the home affairs of the state, which made me imagine that, provided he would avow his past faults and promise amendment, he might render me good service." Louis XIV sincerely desired to continue to employ Fouquet. He conferred with him a long time, begged that he might be informed of everything, and that nothing of the true state of the finances might be concealed from him. On these conditions, he consented to forget the past, and in future to consider only the services rendered by the superintendent, entering on a legal and regular course of proceeding and foregoing further peculations. But, like many others at the court, Fouquet had deceived himself as to the character of the young king. The latter had announced his resolution to govern by himself, to preside in person over the council, to sign everything after having seen everything, and to gradually enlighten himself upon the administration of his kingdom, with the view of always being able to direct it properly. Very few had believed in the permanence of this resolution of a young king of 22, to which, however, he was faithful till his death, and even Anne of Austria herself had derided it. Conceiving himself master of the king's mind through those who surrounded him, and imagining that, thanks to his numerous spies, he was acquainted with every one of his plans, convinced, moreover, that his master, occupied with his pleasures, would be quickly repelled by irksome labor, Fouquet had persisted in his criminal conduct, and had remained deaf to the warnings of his friends. But whilst he daily presented Louis XIV with falsified accounts, in which the expenses were increased and the receipts diminished, Colbert, to whom they were sent every evening, examined them carefully, indicated the embezzlements, and enlightened the king upon the persevering audacity of his minister. At the same time, Fouquet continued to fortify his towns, to extend his influence, to fabricate loans to the king, to secure for himself under other names the farming of several taxes, and to appoint his creatures to the most important offices, which he secretly bought for them in the hope of soon rendering himself the sovereign ruler of the state. This was not all. This individual who aspired to replace Mazarin, to whom he was so inferior because, unlike him, he was not prompted by true national interests, possessed moreover only the lofty aims of the ambitious, but neither tact nor clear-sightedness. With a keen mind and quick understanding, he very rapidly discerned the surface of things, but was wanting in the cardinal's penetrating sagacity and depth of vision. And whilst the latter, with a less vulgar ambition, occupied himself much more with the reality than with the semblance of power, Fouquet, vain and frivolous, could not resist the puerile satisfaction of making a parade of his authority and wealth. We are acquainted with the scandalous pomp of the fête given in the Château of Vaux, that anticipated Versailles, with its magnificent galleries, its splendid gardens, and its shameless luxury. We have this example, the most striking perhaps which history affords, of a man possessed with that folly which precedes great falls, and accelerating by his insolence a catastrophe already rendered inevitable by so many other faults. There is, indeed, nothing obscure in the causes of this catastrophe, whatever may have been said respecting it. How it came to pass, the circumstances which accompanied it, every one of the incidents of a trial which lasted 3 years, the accusations of the prosecution, as well as the arguments of the defense, have all been brought to light, and it is impossible not to feel convinced that St. Mars is false, and not for the possession of a state secret, or for I know not what hidden crime which he would have mysteriously expiated by wearing, until his death, a velvet mask. It has been pretended, without any authentic proof being furnished, that Louis XIV not only discovered in him a powerful and wealthy rival, but that the arrest of the surintendant was simply a piece of revenge on the part of the royal lover of La Vallière. Owing to the steadfast friendship of La Fontaine and Madame de Sévigné, to their persistence in their illusions, and to the eloquent sincerity of their complaints, Fouquet must always have many partisans. Even among his contemporaries, the touching devotion of his friends, the passionate attacks of some of his adversaries, and the length of his trial, induced a reaction. And while at first the indignant populace showed their exasperation against him by imprecations and threats, by degrees, as often happens, public opinion changed into sympathy for the victim, and to regarding his judges as persecutors. Lastly, that mysterious legend of the man with the iron mask, which some persons wish to make the climax of Fouquet's career, commences, according to them, from his arrest, and the minute precautions then taken by the king at once indicate and explain all those of which the famous masked prisoner was later to be the object. Louis XIV was naturally inclined to dissimulation. Mazarin not only set him the example of this cunning and necessary virtue, but advised him to practice it, and never, it must be remembered, was this counsel more strictly followed than during the few months which preceded Fouquet's fall. From the time it was resolved upon, Louis XIV, aided by Colbert and Letellier, prepared in detail and in secret everything that could assure the punctual execution of his orders and anticipate the slightest difficulty. It cannot be denied that he lulled the surintendant into security and cradled him with deceptive hopes, and that with infinite art he never treated him more graciously than after he had decided upon his ruin. Fouquet, as procureur general to the Parliament, could only be judged by that body. His acquittal would thus have been nearly certain, since he had a great number of partisans in it. It was therefore essential that he should resign this position in order that he might be brought before a chamber of justice. It was Colbert, his ardent enemy, who ventured to give him this pernicious advice, and who, with a skill inspired by hatred, prevailed on the surintendant without exciting his mistrust. Louis XIV, you facilitated Colbert's task by hinting to the vain, glorious Fouquet that the color of the order and the dignity of prime minister would be irreconcilable with the functions of procureur général. At the same time, he exhibited towards him an unusual confidence, often called him into his presence, followed his advice, and overwhelmed his brother, the Bishop of Agde, with favors. The grand blow of the arrest was to be struck in Brittany, as it was thought that the presence of the king there would render resistance on the part of the fortified places in the surintendant's power more difficult, and the idea of advising this journey was suggested to him. The minute precautions taken at the time of the arrest, those musketeers assembled under the pretext of a royal hunt and placed at the disposal of D'Artagnan, the troops occupying the roads and allowing no one but the royal couriers to pass, those long private interviews of Louis XIV, first with Letellier and then with D'Artagnan, the most improbable obstacles foreseen and the care taken to leave nothing to chance, all this offers, it is true, the singular spectacle of an absolute monarch conspiring the fall of one of his subjects. But how can one be astonished at it when this subject is Fouquet, alone able to dispose of immense wealth in the midst of general distress, and counting devoted pensioners even amongst the officers surrounding the king? How can one be astonished, moreover, when Louis XIV could not even place confidence in the captain of his guards? When we know that Fouquet could do as he pleased with the Mediterranean fleets through the Marquis de Crequi, general of the galleys, and with those of the ocean through the Admiral de Nouches, when Brittany had in some degree become his kingdom, and most of the places in the north had his creatures for commandants, how can one be astonished above all things, after having read the famous plan of resistance found among the Saint-Mandé papers, a veritable plan of a civil war long meditated, written entirely by Fouquet, and one in which he braves and defies the authority of his sovereign? The parts to be played in the revolt are distributed among his friends, the chiefs are designated, the places of refuge indicated. Fouquet makes known what arms are to be employed, what hostages it will be necessary to secure, all the means of agitation are advised. Through his two brothers, the coadjutor of Narbonne and the Bishop of Agde, the clergy are to be stirred up. By means of certain members of the Parliament, disturbances are to be excited in Paris, and the war of pamphlets kindled anew. By means of the governors, the public treasures are to be seized, and the garrisons are to be sent forth onto the highways. Lastly, supreme treason, foreign help is not to be lost sight of, and Lorraine as well as Spain is to be summoned to enter France. So much audacity and such an exaggerated pride sufficiently explain the dissimulation and the minute solicitude of Louis XIV, without one seeking the cause elsewhere. But if he matured this coup d'etat in secret, and accomplished it with a prudence without which he would have certainly failed, none of the crimes which rendered it necessary were hidden from contemporaries. The preparations for the arrest were alone mysterious. During the 3 following years, every one of the documents relating to the trial was presented to the judges, communicated to Fouquet, and was the subject of long discussions. From this, there resulted the proof of his skill in argument, but not at all of his innocence. On account of his extortions and of his plan of revolt, he had, according to the laws and customs of the time, deserved death. The majority of his judges condemned him to banishment, a punishment rightly considered too lenient by Louis XIV, who changed it into perpetual imprisonment. But long before his condemnation, the numerous memoirs which the accused composed in order to defend himself had been secretly printed by his friends and circulated among the people. There had thus been nothing ignored or left in obscurity. There is nothing imaginary or hypothetical in the account of what preceded and brought about Fouquet's imprisonment. It is essential to establish this first of all. Let us now see if, during his stay at Pignerol, any event occurred which, 16 years after his condemnation, could all at once have determined Louis XIV to simulate Fouquet's death and to make of a captive, long since inoffensive and forgotten, that mysterious and nameless prisoner who is to come from the Isle Sainte Marguerite to die obscurely in the Bastille. Chapter 16. Remark of Fouquet's mother. The prisoner's piety, danger which he escapes at Pignerol. Incessant supervision over him at La Pérouse, near Pignerol. Excessive scruples of Saint-Mars, precautions prescribed by Louvois, espionage exercised over Fouquet by his servants and his confessor, illnesses of the prisoner. He devotes himself entirely to study, and to religious meditations, works to which he gives himself up. His new motto. Interest which he continues to take in all his relations and in Louis XIV. Saint-Mars's laconic answers. The fortitude with which Fouquet supported adversity has almost caused his contemporaries to forget how he had allowed himself to be blinded and led astray by prosperity. Without exhibiting this excessive indulgence, without going so far as to take the part of the victim against his judges, or to forget his errors and his faults, one cannot prevent oneself from owning that at Pignerol he nobly expiated them by his unceasing resignation, by his firmness, and by the elevation of his sentiments. When Fouquet's mother heard of his arrest, she threw herself upon her knees, exclaiming, "It is now, O God, that I have hopes of my son's salvation!" This prayer of a pious woman whom the grandeur of the surintendent had never dazzled, and whom his dissipation had caused to mourn, was fully answered. If so unhappy as to survive her son and to be ignorant of none of his sufferings, her sorrow may at least have been softened by the thought that the prisoner of Pignerol sought consolation in religion and study. During the early period of his imprisonment at Angers, depressed by misfortune, but sustained by the remembrance of the counsels and the virtues of his mother, he had, in a touching letter, imbued with the most pious sentiments, requested a confessor. A terrible danger encountered by him at Pignerol 6 months after his arrival, and which he escaped as if by a miracle, went to confirm him more completely in these sentiments. In the middle of the month of June, 1665, a thunderbolt fell upon the donjon of the citadel and set fire to the powder magazine. A portion of the donjon was blown down, and a large number of soldiers were entombed beneath the ruins. Fouquet's chamber was reached by the explosion. Some of the walls fell, and the furniture was shattered to pieces. St. Mars thought that his prisoner was killed, but he was found in the embrasure of a projecting window, and had not even received a bruise. As the repairs in the donjon necessitated by this disaster could not be completed in less than a year, Fouquet, by orders of Louis XIV, and Louvois, was transferred for a time to the neighboring chateau of La Pérouse. Here commenced the attempts made by the prisoner, not so much to escape. He could not be mistaken as to the impossibility of succeeding in this, as to write to his mother and his wife, and to obtain from them letters expected in vain since his departure from Paris. "I have received the letters written by M. Fouquet," Louvois informs Saint-Mars, July 26. "The king has seen the whole, and was not surprised that he should do his utmost to obtain news, and that you exert all your efforts to prevent his receiving it. To give and receive news, such indeed was Fouquet's most lively and very natural desire. In order to satisfy it, he made the most industrious efforts and showed the most ingenious patience. With soot mixed with a few drops of water he made ink, a fowl's bone served him for a pen, and he wrote upon a handkerchief which he afterwards concealed in the back of his chair. He managed even to compound an ink, which he employed to cover the margin of a book with some lines of writing that became visible only after being warmed. But St. Mars's vigilance frustrated these attempts. He soon discovered the hidden handkerchief, and not content with sending this alone to the king, also forwarded the clumsy implements fabricated and used by his prisoner. The latter having afterwards written upon ribbons. Black ones only were in future given him, and his garments were, moreover, lined with stuff of the same color. From this period he became the object of a still closer surveillance, the proof of which we find in the numerous letters exchanged between Louvois and Saint-Mars. Like all timorous people, Saint-Mars was absolutely wanting in the spirit of initiation and took delight in having recourse to his chief. He possessed no ambitious desire of exhibiting his zeal, but only an imperious need of dissipating his alarms and of relieving himself from responsibility. It did not suffice this timid gaoler to adopt the most minute precautions with respect to his prisoner. He recounted them in his correspondence with the minister, with the view of obtaining fresh orders, or of receiving an approval which might calm his uneasiness. It was in this spirit that he begged Louvois to authorize him to have a salt-cellar made for Fouquet out of his 2 broken candlesticks. It was in this spirit also that after having prevented his prisoner's servant from giving an alms, considering it suspicious, he consulted the minister on the subject and solicited his advice. These excessive scruples sometimes caused him to be wanting in humanity. He one day considered it necessary to ask Louvois for an authorization to have a sick prisoner bled, and the minister, on according it 20 days afterwards, added, "Whenever such circumstances occur, you can have the prisoner, treated and doctored as may be needful without awaiting orders for it." The puerile questions and the demands for fresh instructions became so frequent that the minister was compelled to write to St. Mars, "I have received your 2 last letters. They oblige me to tell you that, as the king has charged you with the care of Mons, Fouquet, his majesty, has no new orders to give you to prevent his escape or his sending or receiving letters." This outburst is so much the more significant as Louvois, very prone and qualified to enter into the slightest details, and an imperious and most exacting chief, accustomed all his subordinates to extreme deference and to having incessant recourse to his authority. But in this case the minister's prejudices were outstripped, and St. Mars alone perhaps had the power to wear out by his pertinacity him who on ordinary occasions was most desirous of being consulted. Moreover, we must admit, it was the only instance in which the minister manifested his displeasure. He habitually replied with care to every detail comprised in the letters from the commandant of Pignerol, and he sometimes even rivaled him in his want of confidence. Thus it was that in December 1670, Fouquet, who was ill, having obtained authority to have a prescription drawn up by Piquet, his former medical attendant, Louvois, sent it to St. Mars with these words, "As soon as you have received it, you will make a very exact copy. You will show the original to M. Fouquet, and you and he will compare it with the copy which you will leave with him. You will then burn the original. By this means the said Sieur Fouquet, having seen it, will have no doubt, and you, having burnt it, will have no anxiety about it." On another occasion, when sending a chest of tea for Fouquet, Louvois prescribed to St. Mars to empty it into another receptacle, and to take away the chest, and the paper which may be within the chest, so as to leave to M. Mars, Fouquet, the said tea only. Never were orders more agreeable or more faithfully executed. These precautions of Louvois encouraged St. Mars's distrust, who thus found himself supported in his conduct by that authority, most persuasive when it emanates from one above us in station, namely, example. Thus stimulated in suspicions to which he naturally inclined, St. Mars was not slow to conceive that his means of surveillance were insufficient. To see one's prisoner often, to assure oneself with one's own eyes that he communicates with nobody, to examine with care his furniture and effects, to multiply the difficulties of an escape, seemed to constitute all the duties of a conscientious and vigilant gaoler. But the suspicious St. Mars was in no wise satisfied with these precautions. Forgetting that the prisoner's body alone was under his care, he wished to extend his surveillance even to Fouquet's thoughts. To attain this end, he had recourse both to his confessor and to the servant who waited upon him. Having, however, soon discerned the interest which the unfortunate prisoner inspired in his servant, St. Mars felt that he could not rely upon the sincerity of his reports, and he attached to the person of Fouquet a second valet, who was instructed to watch the first, and was himself the object of a secret surveillance on the part of the latter. As for the confessor, to control him was impossible, and in fact would have been unnecessary. We read in the correspondence of Louvois and St. Mars that he was a good man, which is another proof how differently the conduct of men may be appreciated. In the eyes of Louvois and of St. Mars, Fouquet's confessor was a good man because he consented to act as a spy, because, as Fouquet wrote later to his wife, instead of having God in view, he acted the cowardly part of making his fortune at the expense of one in trouble. He succeeded, for St. Mars obtained a promise from Louvois that he should receive a living when he should cease to fulfill his office. The first instructions given to St. Mars authorized him to change the priest each time that Fouquet desired to confess. But when they had discovered this good man, they abandoned henceforth this useless precaution, and Fouquet in vain requested to be allowed to make a general confession to the superior of the Jesuits, then to the superiors of the Recollets and Capucines of Pignerol. These proceedings, and the non-success of an attempt made in 1669 by an old servant of Fouquet's, who endeavored, by corrupting some soldiers, to place himself in communication with his master, induced the latter to give himself up entirely to study and religious meditations. He renounced the project of communicating with his relations and friends. The salvation of his soul and the care of his body alone occupied his thoughts. Deprived long since of all physical exercise, and having suddenly exchanged an existence excited by travel and adorned by everything that could make life attractive and sweet for the solitude and inactivity of a prison, Fouquet had seen his health rapidly decay and innumerable disorders seize on him. "There is not a disease to which the body is liable," he wrote to his wife, "of which mine has not experienced some symptom. I am no sooner quit of one than it is succeeded by another, and I can but suppose that these will only cease with my life. I should require a large volume to describe my sufferings in detail, but the principal one is that my stomach does not act in concert with my liver. What suits one is injurious to the other, and, what is more, my legs are always swollen. The best thing to be done," he says afterwards, "is to give up all care of the body and to think of one's soul. This is important to us, and yet we show more concern for the body." In truth, he gave as much attention to one as to the other. Distrustful of the surgeon of the citadel, he compounded himself the remedies which suited him best, and in order, no doubt, that he might avail himself of his servant as an auxiliary, he instructed him in the art of dispensing. The first books which St. Mars consented to give him after having received authority to do so were the Bible and a history of France. Later, the works of Clavius and St. Bonaventura were added, and then, by desire of the prisoner, a dictionary of rhymes. Poetry to him was nothing more than a relaxation, and he devoted himself above all to reading religious works and to the production of several lengthy treatises on morals. The remembrance of his former grandeur clashed in them with the impressions of his profound fall. The Christian preoccupied with his salvation, the philosopher enlightened by adversity, the recluse giving himself up to the contemplation of divine things, hold in their turn a language of sublime and unchangeable serenity. One finds in almost every page proof of this resignation in disgrace, and of this contentment in affliction which Christianity can alone inspire. He whose haughty motto, for a long time justified by events, had been quo non ascendam, now humbly submissive to his lot, adopted the touching emblem of the silkworm in his cocoon with these words, inclusum labor illustrat. However, Fouquet was not so detached from things terrestrial as not to interest himself in them at all. His mother, wife, and several children being still alive, his thoughts often turned towards these dearly beloved beings, and also, but without bitterness, towards Louis XIV, and his conquests, towards the court and the ministers. He often questioned St. Mars. The latter's replies were brief, and so unprecise that he considered himself obliged to write to Louvois and inquire in what sense he ought to answer. Entirely master of his prisoner, sure of those who surrounded him, he believed that the barrier which he had erected around him was insuperable, and thought that he would be able to keep him apprised of contemporary events as he pleased, or else leave him in the most complete ignorance. Useless efforts and vain confidence in his power. The enterprising audacity and industrious perseverance of a prisoner recently brought to Pignerol triumphed over even the innumerable precautions of the most suspicious of gaolers. Chapter 17. Sudden and singular arrival of Lauzun in Fouquet's room. The latter had known him formerly under the name of the Marquis de Puigilhem. Lauzun enumerates his dignities and calls himself the king's cousin. Fouquet believes his visitor mad. Portrait of Lauzun, his adventures, his arrival at Pignerol. He continues his visits to Fouquet. The stories he tells him. Noble conduct of Louis XIV. Towards Lauzun, audacious method employed by the latter to overhear a conversation between Louis XIV and Madame de Montespan. Difference between the conduct of Lauzun and that of Fouquet. Lauzun's outbursts against Saint Mars. Perplexity of the latter. Singular mode of surveillance to which he has recourse. Progressive amelioration of the lot of the two prisoners. They receive permission to see each other. Arrival of Fouquet's daughter at Pignerol. Misunderstanding between Fouquet and Lauzun. Misunderstanding between Fouquet and Lauzun. Cause of this misunderstanding. One day, in the early part of the year 1672, Fouquet hears one of the articles of furniture in his room suddenly thrown down, and perceives a man of short stature and slender figure creep through a narrow opening and advance smiling towards him. He is dressed in the full uniform of Captain of the King's Guard, blue with red facings. Nothing except the sword is wanting in this costume, the rich embroideries and brilliant insignia of which offer a singular contrast to the place where it is worn. The attitude of the newcomer is haughty, and his air almost patronizing. Fouquet hesitates to recognize in him a poor Gascon cadet, the Marquis of Puygilhem, without fortune or position, who had sometimes come to him in the days of his power to borrow a little money, and who, extremely fortunate in having been received into the house of the Marshal de Gramont, his relative, had cut a very sad figure at court at the time of Fouquet's arrest. What, therefore, was the astonishment of the latter when his strange visitor, questioned as to the causes of his detention at Pignerol, replies that they have been set forth by the king in a letter addressed to all the French ambassadors abroad. Fouquet's stupefaction is redoubled when he learns that this costume is not a masquerade, and that the man whom he had left in the lowest rank at Versailles is really captain of the guard, and in addition governor of Berry and colonel-general of dragoons, and that a brevet rank of general has been conferred upon him. But when his visitor, continuing his confidences, enumerates his titles and proclaims himself Count de Lauzun, Duc de Montpensier, Dauphin of Auvergne, Sovereign of Dombes, Count d'Eu and de Mortagne, and, finally, husband of the Grande Mademoiselle and cousin german of Louis XIV, Fouquet ceases to feel surprised. Everything is explained, the speaker is mad, the tortures of a prolonged confinement have unsettled his mind and led him to take all these fancies for real. Everyone would have thought as Fouquet did, and this supposition was certainly the most probable one. Indeed, Lauzun, of whom La Bruyère has said that it is not permitted to dream as he lived, encountered, in his existence of 91 years, such diversities of fortune, such striking contrasts, such unheard-of revolutions, that there are few heroes of the imagination to whom one would have dared to ascribe similar adventures.